She pretends to be the twin sister of an heiress to gain access to the fortune, but the suspicious millionaire soon discovers the truth and offers an irresistible deal. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the tiny apartment in Queens, New York, making Madison Porter jump out of her chair. Her fingers trembled over the laptop where she had just seen, for the 1000th time, the photo of Charlotte Avery, the woman who could be her identical twin, were it not for the crucial detail that they were not related. NYPD, open the door. Madison's heart raced. With quick movements, she closed all the browser tabs, deleted her search history, and turned off her computer. 3 months of investigating Charlotte Avery, memorizing every detail of her life, and now... The doorbell rang again, more insistently. "Just a minute," Madison shouted, running to the mirror. The reflection showed exactly what she had expected. The same gray-green eyes as Charlotte, the same heart-shaped face, right down to the small scar above her right eyebrow that she had meticulously recreated with makeup. The resemblance was disturbing, almost supernatural. Taking a deep breath, Madison opened the door. "Miss Porter," Detective Richard Morrison held up his badge. "We need to ask you a few questions about your recent activities at the First Manhattan Bank." Madison felt her blood run cold. She had been careful, extremely careful. How could they... "There must be some mistake," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I don't have an account at First Manhattan." "Exactly," the detective replied, his studious eyes fixed on her. "But Charlotte Avery does, and witnesses report seeing someone very similar to you. Or was it her? Trying to access the account last week." Madison allowed an expression of genuine confusion to cross her face. Months of practice in front of the mirror had given her precise control over every facial muscle. "Charlotte Avery?" She frowned. "I don't know anyone by that name." Detective Morrison stepped forward, occupying the doorway. "Miss Porter, we have evidence that you have been researching the Avery family extensively. We know you've been monitoring Charlotte's movements for weeks. The question is, why?" It was at that moment that Madison's cell phone vibrated. A message. Her eyes drifted for a split second to the illuminated screen on the table. The name of the sender made her heart leap. Alexander Avery. "I know who you are and what you're trying to do. Meet me tonight, 8 p.m., at the Capitol Grill. Come as yourself, not as my sister. We have a deal to discuss." The detective followed her gaze, but Madison had already regained her composure. "I'm sorry, Detective, but without a warrant, I can't help you. If you'll excuse me, I'm late for an appointment." Morrison stepped back, but her gaze made it clear that this wasn't over. "Stay in town, Miss Porter. We'll continue this conversation." As soon as he closed the door, Madison leaned against it, trembling. Years of planning, months of preparation, and now everything was falling apart. Or was it? The message from Alexander Avery, the powerful CEO of Avery Industries and Charlotte's brother, suggested an unexpected opportunity. Madison picked up her cell phone, rereading the message. A deal. What kind of deal could a billionaire want with an imposter who tried to pass herself off as his sister? Looking again at her reflection, Madison saw beyond the physical resemblance to Charlotte. She saw the girl from Cleveland who grew up in foster homes, who learned to be who she needed to be to survive, who vowed never to be destitute again. The clock struck 6:45. If she wanted to get to the Capitol Grill on time, she had to leave now. Madison opened her closet, going through the dresses carefully selected to mimic Charlotte's closet. Deep down, she found her own clothes, simpler but authentic. Alexander wanted to meet the real Madison Porter. Very well. As he prepared, his mind raced through various scenarios. Alexander could hand her over to the police. He could ruin her life with a phone call, or he could have something much more interesting in mind. Madison grabbed her bag, checked her makeup one last time, removing the fake scar, and headed out into the New York night. In 2 hours, her fate would be decided at a restaurant table with one of the most powerful men in the city. What she didn't know was that Alexander Avery had secrets of his own, and that the game that was about to begin was much bigger than she could have imagined. The Capitol Grill emanated that kind of discreet luxury that Madison knew only from her research into Charlotte. As she followed the maitre d' to a reserved table at the back of the restaurant, she felt the stares of the other customers, not because of her resemblance to Charlotte Avery, but because of her simple dress. Alexander Avery was already there, studying a tablet. Even seated, his presence dominated the space. At 35, he had transformed Avery Industries from a family business into a technology empire. The business magazines called him the next king of Wall Street, but at that moment, his piercing blue eyes were more like a predator calculating the moment to strike. "Miss Porter," he stood up, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Or should I say, sister?" "Madison's fine," she replied, sitting down. Under the table, her hands shook to contain the trembling. "I don't suppose you called me here to enjoy the cuisine." Alexander gestured, and a waiter instantly appeared with a bottle of red wine. Chateau Margaux 2015. "Charlotte loves this wine. You knew that too, didn't you? Just like you know she's allergic to strawberries, has a chicken pox scar on her back, and cries watching E.T. every time." Madison kept her face neutral, but inside her stomach was churning. He was demonstrating that he knew exactly how much research she had done on her sister. "Impressive homework," Alexander continued, sipping his wine. 3 months of surveillance, hundreds of hours studying photos and videos, even getting a copy of her signature. I must admit, you're exceptionally meticulous. If you already know all this, why didn't you hand me over to the police? Alexander placed the cup on the table with millimeter precision. "Because you could be exactly what I need." The waiter returned to take their orders. Madison barely registered what she had chosen, her senses totally focused on the man in front of her. "Charlotte is unwell," Alexander explained after the waiter walked away. "A problem with substances that the family prefers to keep secret. She's in a clinic in Switzerland and will be there for at least 6 months. Madison processed the information. "And that's a problem because in 3 months, the company's board will vote on a crucial merger with Weber Technologies. Charlotte owns 15% of the shares, and according to the family agreement, she needs to be present in person to vote." Alexander leaned forward. "If they find out she's incapacitated, the shares will be frozen. The merger will fail." "And you want me to stand in for her at the vote," Madison added, the pieces falling into place. "For 3 months, you will live as Charlotte, appear at the necessary events, and vote as I direct." Alexander opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "In exchange, $5 million and my guarantee that your recent activities will be forgotten." Madison took the contract, but her eyes remained on his. "Why me? I could easily forge her signature, create a power of attorney. Because Weber will require biometric verification of the main shareholders. And you," he gestured to his face, "are the only bypass we have." The main course arrived, but Madison barely noticed. Her mind was calculating quickly. 5 million would solve all her financial problems, but 3 months living a lie, under constant scrutiny. "What if I say no?" Alexander smiled, picking up his cell phone. "So this photo of you trying to access Charlotte's account arrives at the FBI right now, along with evidence of your other adventures in Cleveland. That insurance scam was especially creative, by the way." Madison felt her blood run cold. How had he found out about Cleveland? "You have until noon tomorrow to decide," Alexander said, standing up. "The address is in the contract, and Madison." He paused, placing some notes on the table. "Come as Charlotte. Your current closet doesn't suit the role." After he left, Madison remained seated, the contract weighing on her hands like lead. The restaurant continued its elegant buzz around them, waiters gliding silently between tables, glasses clinking in distant toasts. But in his mind, a storm was brewing. $5 million. Freedom from his past. All he had to do was become someone else for 3 months. But as she reread the contract, a nagging doubt nagged at her. Why was Alexander Avery, known for his ruthless business acumen, willing to pay so much for her silence? What else was at stake in this merger? Madison folded up the contract and put it in her handbag. As she left the restaurant, The Manhattan night enveloped her with its bright lights and dangerous promises. Somewhere in Switzerland, the real Charlotte Avery was fighting her demons. And here, Madison Porter was preparing to create some of her own. Charlotte Avery's closet was bigger than Madison's entire apartment in Queens. Rows of designer dresses, handmade Italian shoes and handbags that cost more than a car stretched out like a private museum of luxury. Madison slid her fingers through the soft fabric of a Valentino dress, trying to ignore the voice in her head that screamed that she didn't belong there. "This is Charlotte's social schedule for the next few weeks," Regina Palmer, Alexander's designated personal assistant, explained as she navigated an iPad. A woman in her 50s, Regina had the kind of glacial efficiency that made Madison wonder if she, too, knew about the hoax. "Tomorrow you have lunch with the Met's Art Committee, then a meeting at the Foundation's office." Madison nodded, memorizing every detail as she looked at herself in the full-length mirror. The navy blue Chanel dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Technically, it had been made for Charlotte, but the irony of the situation didn't escape her. "Charlotte's cell phone password?" Madison asked, trying on her Louboutin heels. "It's already been changed to the one you chose," Regina replied without raising her eyes. "All important contacts have been dialed. Alexander suggested that you avoid answering old messages for the time being." The penthouse apartment on Park Avenue was a study in minimalist elegance, shades of white and gray, modern art on the walls, panoramic views of Manhattan through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Every object seemed to have been chosen with surgical precision to project exactly the image Charlotte Avery wanted to convey to the world. "What about the building staff?" "They were informed that you were traveling. No one will question your presence." Regina finally looked at Madison. "But I suggest you practice her signature more. It's still very hesitant." Madison picked up a pen and notepad, tracing the signature she had studied for weeks. Every curve and flourish had to be perfect. Her life, literally, depended on it. Regina's phone rang. "Mr. Avery," she answered, her tone changing subtly. "Yes, we're finalizing the arrangements. I understand. Right away." Hanging up, she turned to Madison. "Change of plans. The meeting with the Met Committee has been canceled. Alexander wants you at the Avery Industries office tomorrow at 9 a.m. It seems that Weber Technologies has brought forward some discussions." Madison felt a knot in her stomach. She wasn't prepared to dive so deep so quickly. "I thought we'd have a few weeks before—" "Things have changed," Regina cut in, efficiently. "The car will be here at 8:30. I suggest you study these files tonight." She handed over a thick folder. "These are the latest financial reports and details of the merger. Charlotte has always been known for her acute understanding of business." After Regina left, Madison sank into the Italian leather sofa, the heavy folder on her lap. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that seemed surreal through the polarized glass. Her cell phone, Charlotte's new one, vibrated with a message from Alexander. "Dinner tomorrow. Harbor Room at Le Bernardin, 8 p.m. We need to discuss the board." Madison started to type a reply, but stopped. How would Charlotte respond? Formal? Casual? There were so many layers to this farce, so many details to manage. A noise in the hallway made her freeze. Footsteps, a key in the lock. But Regina had said that no one else had access to the apartment. The door opened. "Charlie, are you home?" The male voice was unfamiliar. Madison stood up in a panic, her heart pounding. From the heels of her shoes, she calculated the distance to the master bedroom. Charlotte. Footsteps approached the room. Madison grabbed her briefcase and cell phone, moving silently towards the hallway. But before she could reach it, a man appeared in the doorway, tall, athletic, in his early 30s. His brown hair messed up in a way that suggested it had cost him a fortune to look like that. His eyes widened at the sight of her. "You're back. Why didn't you tell me?" Madison's brain worked furiously. From the familiarity, the way he used his surname, the key. This could only be Nicholas Crawford, Charlotte's boyfriend who, according to her research, was traveling in Europe, and who, apparently, had returned earlier. Madison forced a smile, praying that her panic wouldn't show. Nick. What a surprise. What Alexander hadn't mentioned, or perhaps didn't know, was that playing Charlotte Avery would be much more complicated than just attending business meetings. And now, facing the man who knew every detail of the real Charlotte's life, Madison realized that she was much deeper in this pit than she had imagined. The meeting room on the 45th floor of Avery Industries overlooked the Empire State Building, but Madison barely noticed the landscape. Her eyes were fixed on the 12 faces around the mahogany table, each one a potential detector of her deception. As you can see from the projected figures, Daniel Weber, CEO of Weber Technologies, gestured at the graphs on the screen. The merger will provide a 40% increase in production capacity in the first year. Madison maintained the posture she had studied in hundreds of Charlotte videos. Back straight, chin slightly raised, occasionally making elegant notes in a leather briefcase. The previous evening with Nicholas had been a crash course in improvisation. "Sorry I took so long yesterday," she had told him, using the exhaustion of the trip as an excuse to go to bed early. "I'm still adjusting my internal clock." Nicholas had accepted the explanation easily, perhaps because Charlotte really did tend to be distant, perhaps because he was too busy recounting his own adventures in Europe. Madison had memorized every detail, knowing that she would need to keep the conversation consistent in the future. "Miss Avery," Weber's voice brought her back to the present. "Any comments on the cost projection?" Madison felt Alexander tensing subtly beside her. This was the first real test. "Actually, yes." She opened her folder, mentally thanking him for the hours she had spent studying the reports. "The projection seems optimistic considering the current volatility of the semiconductor market. The data on page 47 suggests that we would need at least 18 months to reach this capacity, not 12. A momentary silence followed his remark. Daniel Weber adjusted his tie, clearly not expecting this level of scrutiny. "Insightful as ever, Charlotte," he replied with a strained smile. "But our internal research, based on last quarter's metrics," Madison interrupted, feeling her confidence grow, "which don't reflect the impact of the new Asian legislation on importing components." Alexander disguised a smile by sipping his water. Across the table, Regina Palmer made a note on her tablet. The meeting went on for another 2 hours, each minute a tightrope walk between demonstrating competence and not drawing too much attention. When it was finally over, Madison felt as if she had run a marathon. "Impressive," Alexander muttered as they left the room. "I almost forgot it wasn't really Charlotte there." "I just did my job," she replied quietly, aware of the other executives around her. "About that," Alexander checked his Patek Philippe. "There's been a change of plans for tonight. Dinner at Le Bernardin is canceled. I need you to represent the family at a charity event at MoMA." Madison stopped walking. "What? It wasn't on the schedule. It came up at the last minute. Regina will give you the details." He smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Oh, and Nicholas mentioned that he'll be accompanying you." The private elevator opened its chrome doors. Madison stepped inside, feeling the weight of Alexander's gaze. "By the way," he added as the doors closed, "lovely detail about the Asian legislation, except that this information was only released internally this morning. Charlotte wouldn't have had access to it." Madison felt her blood run cold. The elevator began to descend. "Don't worry," Alexander's voice echoed in the confined space. "No one else has noticed, but be careful. Sometimes being too smart is as dangerous as being too dumb." The doors opened in the lobby, and Madison stepped out, her legs trembling slightly. Her cell phone vibrated, a message from Nicholas. "I can't wait for tonight. I've missed being your date to these events. Pick you up at 7 p.m. Crossing the marble lobby of Avery Industries, Madison realized that she was sailing into deeper and deeper waters. Every person who knew Charlotte was a potential threat. Every interaction, a possibility of exposure. Regina was waiting for her on the sidewalk, next to a black Mercedes. "The dress for tonight is already sorted," she informed Madison as she got into the car. "Valentino red. Charlotte always wears red to MoMA events." Madison nodded, her mind already calculating the next steps. She needed to research modern art before the event, review the museum's latest exhibitions, memorize curators' names. The car glided through Manhattan traffic. In the tinted glass, Madison saw her reflection, or was it Charlotte's? And for a frightening moment, she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Her cell phone vibrated again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. "I know you're not her. Meet me at the MoMA Sculpture Garden at 9 p.m., or everyone will know too." MoMA's Sculpture Garden was illuminated by soft lights, turning the metal pieces into silent sentinels against the Manhattan night sky. Madison checked her Cartier watch, a welcome gift from Alexander, for 2055. For the last 40 minutes, she had navigated the charity event as if she had been born for it. The red Valentino dress was silk armor, every smile a carefully constructed mask. Nicholas stood beside her, his hand occasionally resting on her waist, with an intimacy that made her want to flinch. "I need to check a few things with the curator," she had lied, slipping out of the main hall. Nicholas tried to follow her, but a convenient call from his office stopped him. Now, alone among the sculptures, Madison felt every nerve in her body on alert. The anonymous message weighed on her mind like lead. "You've really outdone yourself this time." A female voice emerged from the shadows. A figure emerged from behind an abstract sculpture, platinum blonde hair, elegant black dress, heels that echoed softly on the stone floor. "Rachel!" Madison felt her stomach sink as she recognized Charlotte's younger sister, the only person who didn't appear in any of the files Alexander had provided. "Then you know who I am." Rachel stopped a few steps away, studying Madison with blue eyes identical to her brother's. "But the question is, who are you?" Madison kept her composure, even though she could feel the cold sweat on her back. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please," Rachel rolled her eyes. "I grew up with Charlotte. Do you really think I wouldn't notice the difference? The real question is why Alexander's allowing this." Her brother's name made Madison hesitate. Rachel smiled, predatory. "Ah, so he's involved. Of course he is." She began to circle Madison slowly. "Let me guess, Charlotte is indisposed, and you're the convenient replacement to make sure everything goes according to his plans." "Rachel, No." Rachel held up a hand. "Don't insult my intelligence with more lies. I want the truth. Where's my sister?" The distant sound of the party reached them, soft music and muffled laughter creating a surreal contrast to the tension of the moment. "She's safe," Madison finally answered. "Recovering." "In Switzerland?" Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "That ridiculously expensive clinic where Alexander sends all the family's problems? Typical." Madison noticed something in Rachel's tone. It wasn't just anger. It was deep hurt. "He didn't tell you." "Alexander never tells me anything," Rachel replied. "I'm just the troublesome sister who needs to be kept out of the spotlight." "But Charlotte..." Her voice faltered slightly. "Charlotte always told me everything." Madison saw an opportunity. "She's really trying to do better this time." "How would you know? You're just an actress hired for a part." Rachel moved closer. "But here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me exactly where my sister is, or I'm going to go straight to Nicholas and tell him that the woman he kissed today isn't his girlfriend." Madison's cell phone vibrated. A message from Alexander. "Where are you? Weber wants to discuss terms." "TikTok," Rachel smiled. "What's it going to be?" Madison straightened her shoulders, channeling all the authority she had studied in Charlotte. "You're not going to do that." "No? Why not?" "Because you care about Charlotte, and exposing this situation will only hurt her more." Madison took a step forward. "Think of the scandal, the headlines. Avery Heiress, hospitalized for drug addiction. Your sister would lose everything, her shares, her position on the board, the reputation she's built up." Rachel paled slightly. "You don't know her." "I know enough to understand that she's fighting for her life right now, and I know that you're the only person who really cares." A heavy silence fell between them. In the distance, a siren cut through the Manhattan night. 3 days, Rachel finally said. "You have 3 days to get me a video call with Charlotte. No Alexander, no supervision, just me and my sister." "Rachel, 3 days," she repeated. already walking away. Or everyone will know who you really are. Madison watched Rachel disappear among the sculptures, her heart hammering. Her cell phone vibrated again, Nicholas this time. "Where are you, love? Everyone's asking for you." Taking a deep breath, Madison straightened her dress and checked her makeup in the reflection of a metal sculpture. The evening wasn't over yet, and she had several roles to play. But as she walked back to the party, her mind was spinning. How to convince Alexander to allow a call with Charlotte without revealing the meeting with Rachel? How to ensure that the real Charlotte would cooperate? And most importantly, how long before this whole house of cards collapsed? The St. Moritz Clinic shone like a crystal palace against the Swiss Alps. Madison watched the construction through the window of the Avery's private helicopter, her stomach churning, and not just from the turbulence. "Remember," Alexander spoke into his headset, 15 minutes, no more. Charlotte is unpredictable today." Madison nodded, mentally going over the plan. Convincing Alexander to come to Switzerland had been surprisingly easy. All he had to do was mention concerns about the merger and hint that he needed to validate some details with Charlotte in person. What he didn't know about was the iPad hidden in his bag, programmed for a video call with Rachel in exactly 47 minutes. The helicopter landed on the clinic's helipad. A middle-aged doctor was waiting for them, her white coat fluttering in the wind from the propellers. "Dr. Bennett," Alexander greeted. "How is she?" "Lucid. The new drugs are taking effect." The doctor cast a curious glance at Madison, but still very emotional. Madison followed them through the immaculate corridors of the clinic, each step echoing against the marble floor. Patients in expensive gowns wandered through the inner gardens, their vacant expressions contrasting with the luxury around them. "Here," Dr. Bennett stopped in front of a door. "I'll make you comfortable." Alexander grabbed Madison's arm before she entered. "Don't mention Weber Technologies. And if she starts talking about Rachel?" "I know," Madison cut in, gently disentangling herself. 15 days had passed since the meeting at MoMA, and Rachel was getting impatient. The door opened silently. The room was spacious and elegant, more like a hotel suite than a hospital room. And there, sitting in an armchair by the panoramic window, was Charlotte Avery. Madison felt as if she were looking in a distorted mirror. Her face was identical to her own, but there was something different about her eyes, something wild, broken. Her brown hair, normally impeccable in the photos Madison had studied, was disheveled. Her hands, resting in her lap, were shaking slightly. "More doctors?" Charlotte asked, her voice hoarse. Then her eyes focused on Madison and widened. "Oh." "Charlotte," Alexander stepped forward. "As we agreed, this is my replacement." Charlotte let out a harsh laugh. Of course you found someone to replace me. You can't let the empire crumble because of the addict sister, can you?" Madison remained motionless as Charlotte stood up, approaching like a predator studying its prey. "Perfect," she murmured, circling Madison. "The hair, the posture, even the little scar. How long did it take you to train her, Alex? How much are you paying her to pretend to be me?" "Charlotte, please." "No!" She spun around to face her brother. "Don't pretend this is for my sake. It's for the merger, isn't it? It's always business first." Madison watched the interaction, her mind registering every detail. This was not the Charlotte Avery she had studied, the polished executive, the gracious socialite. This was the truth behind the facade. "Miss Avery," Madison spoke softly, using her own accent instead of Charlotte's. "May I speak to you in private?" Alexander started to protest, but Charlotte held up a hand. Yes, I'd like that." Her smile was as sharp as broken glass. "Leave us, Alex. I want to meet my replacement." After Alexander reluctantly left, a heavy silence fell over the room. "Rachel sent you a message," Madison finally said. Charlotte froze. "What?" "She knows I'm impersonating you. She wants to talk to you, the real you." "Impossible. Alex would never allow—" Madison took her iPad out of her bag. "Alex doesn't need to know." Charlotte's hands shook more visibly as she picked up the tablet. "Rachel, Is she all right? Worried about you, angry at him, but mostly missing you. Tears began to form in Charlotte's eyes. She's the only one who really... Alex thinks he can control everything, fix everything with money and power. But Rachel, her voice faltered. Madison checked her watch. We have 30 minutes until the scheduled call. Enough time for you to tell me the truth about the merger with Weber. Charlotte wiped her eyes, a flash of her former strength appearing on her face. The truth. The truth is that there is no merger. It's a hostile takeover in disguise. Alex is going to dismantle Weber, sell off the assets, lay off thousands. He just needs my vote to make it look legitimate. Madison felt her blood run cold. That's why he's willing to pay so much for my silence. 5 million? Charlotte laughed humorlessly. He'll make 50 times that when the dust settles. From the corridor came the sound of Alexander's footsteps returning. Madison quickly put the iPad away. Advice? Charlotte whispered, returning to her chair. Don't trust him. In the end, we're all replaceable in Alexander Avery's world. The door opened. Time's up, Alexander announced. Madison nodded, but before she left, her eyes met Charlotte's one last time. At that moment, they were no longer the original and the copy. They were two women caught in the web of the same man, each struggling in their own way to survive. And Madison knew that for the next 24 hours, she would have to choose sides. Are you absolutely sure about this? Rachel leaned forward in her chair at the Four Seasons bar, her blue eyes shining with a mixture of anger and determination. Because if we're going to do this, there's no going back. Madison slid the documents across the marble table. It was almost midnight, and the bar was practically empty, except for a few lonely executives drowning the pressures of the day in shots of expensive whiskey. Weber Technologies records for the last 6 months, she explained quietly, clearly showing how Alexander has been secretly buying shares through shell companies. The merger is just a front to prevent the share price from skyrocketing before he has full control. Rachel flipped through the papers, her fingers trembling slightly. Charlotte was right all along. She tried to warn me before Alex had her committed. She's not just there because of the drugs, is she? Madison asked, even though she already knew the answer. Charlotte started investigating Alexander's business after our mother died, Rachel replied, her voice bitter. The drugs were just a way of dealing with what she discovered. Alex turned it into a convenient excuse to keep her isolated. Madison took a sip of her martini, feeling the alcohol burn her throat. The last 48 hours since the visit to Switzerland had been a race against time, copying documents, hacking emails, connecting the dots of years of financial manipulation. Her cell phone vibrated, a message from Nicholas. I miss you. Can we see you tomorrow? Madison ignored the message. After everything she had discovered, the guilt of deceiving Nicholas seemed insignificant. The council vote is in 3 days, Rachel continued. If we expose Alexander now, he'll deny everything, Madison cut in. His word against ours. And technically, I'm a criminal who's impersonating his sister. So what's the plan? Madison pulled another document out of her briefcase. That's where you come in. As a member of the Avery family, you have the authority to request an independent audit. With these documents as initial evidence, Regina Palmer's sudden arrival at the bar made them both freeze. Alexander's assistant stopped in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room until she found them. Shit, Rachel muttered. Regina walked over to her table, her face a mask of professional efficiency. Miss Avery, she said, addressing Madison. Mr. Avery requests your presence immediately. It's almost midnight, Madison protested, trying to buy Rachel time to hide the documents. It's urgent. Regina's tone brooked no argument. The car is waiting. Madison exchanged a quick glance with Rachel, a silent conversation passing between them. Rachel nodded imperceptibly. She would take care of the documents. The drive to Alexander's penthouse was silent. Madison watched the lights of Manhattan through the car window, her reflection in the tinted glass looking more and more like a ghost. How many other people had Alexander used and discarded over the years? The private elevator opened directly into his apartment. Alexander was standing by the window, a glass of scotch in his hand. Manhattan glittering at his feet like a carpet of jewels. "Do you know what the most annoying part of being betrayed is?" he asked without turning around. "It's not the betrayal itself. It's realizing that you've underestimated someone." Madison remained silent, calculating the distance to the elevator. "I really thought I'd found the perfect person," Alexander continued, turning to face her. "Smart enough to convince, but desperate enough to be controllable. And then..." He threw an envelope onto the coffee table. Photos of her and Rachel in the bar poured out onto the glass. "Alex." "No." He held up a hand. "Don't insult my intelligence with lies. The question now is, what do we do about it?" Madison straightened her shoulders. "You can hand me over to the police. I'll go to jail for fraud. But the documents we have against you are already in safe hands. The moment I'm arrested, they'll go public." Alexander smiled, that cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. Or we can renegotiate our deal." He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. 10 million, a new passport, a new life anywhere in the world you choose." Madison felt her heart race. "And Charlotte?" "She'll continue to receive the best treatment money can buy." "You mean she'll remain a prisoner?" Alexander shrugged. "We're all prisoners of something, Madison. The question is, which prison do you prefer?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, Manhattan continued its eternal dance of lights, indifferent to the dramas unfolding in its glass and steel towers. Madison thought of Charlotte, alone in her golden suite in the Alps, of Rachel, carrying the weight of years of family secrets, of Nicholas, in love with a ghost. His answer would change everything, but not in the way Alexander had imagined. The Avery Industries boardroom was packed that morning. Board members, Weber Technologies executives, lawyers, and financial journalists, all waiting for the vote that would decide the future of thousands of employees. Madison, still in the role of Charlotte, took her seat to Alexander's right. Her navy blue Chanel dress, chosen by Regina that morning, seemed to weigh a ton. The last 72 hours since her conversation with Alexander in his penthouse had been an exercise in surgical precision. "Before we begin the vote," Daniel Weber stood up, adjusting his tie, "I'd like to express my gratitude to the Avery family for conducting this process with such transparency." Alexander smiled his practiced CEO smile. Madison watched his hands, ever so steady, drum lightly on the table. He still believed that she had accepted his offer of 10 million to disappear after the vote. The door to the meeting room opened. "I'm sorry I'm late," Rachel Avery announced, entering with her folder of documents. Behind her, to everyone's shock, came Charlotte, the real Charlotte. The immediate buzz in the room was cut short by the sound of Alexander dropping his pen. "Charlie?" Nicholas, sitting on the other side of the table, stood up abruptly. His eyes alternated between the two identical women. Charlotte looked different from the last time Madison had seen her at the clinic. Her hair was impeccable, her white suit perfectly tailored. Her eyes, once clouded by medication, now shone with determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rachel began, handing out folders to each member of the council. "Before the vote, there is some information that needs to be considered." "This is absurd," Alexander stood up. "Charlotte is indisposed. This person is clearly an imposter." "The only imposter here," Charlotte said, her voice strong and clear, "is me. Or rather, Madison Porter was the imposter, hired by my own brother to replace me while I was supposedly recuperating in Switzerland." Chaos erupted in the room. Nicholas paled, recoiling from Madison as if she were toxic. Daniel Weber was frantically leafing through the documents Rachel had handed out, his face turning redder and redder. "In the folders in front of you," Rachel continued, implacable, "you will find detailed evidence of how Alexander Avery has been manipulating this merger from the start. Ghost companies, inside information, even my forced hospitalization when I started investigating." "That's slander," Alexander snarled. "Guards." "The police and the SEC have already been notified," Madison finally said, standing up. "All the documents have been verified by 3 independent auditing firms in the last 48 hours. Charlotte approached Madison, stopping a few steps away. It was surreal, like looking in a mirror that showed not just her reflection, but a different path her life could have taken. When Madison came to me at the clinic, Charlotte explained to the stunned room, it wasn't to plot against Alexander. It was to help me expose the truth. "The $10 million, Alexander muttered, looking at Madison. "I offered $10 million. "Some things are priceless," Madison replied simply. The doors to the room opened again. Federal agents entered, led by Detective Morrison, the same one who had visited Madison in her apartment what seemed like a lifetime ago. "Alexander Avery," Morrison announced, "you are under arrest for financial fraud, market manipulation, and several other crimes that my colleagues at the SEC will be happy to detail." As Alexander was handcuffed, his empire crumbling around him, Madison felt a hand touch her arm. It was Nicholas. "I didn't really realize," he began. "No," Madison interrupted him gently. "You loved Charlotte. That's real. The rest was a necessary illusion." Hours later, Madison was in her small apartment in Queens, packing. The press was in a frenzy over the Avery scandal, and her picture, along with Charlotte's, was all over the news websites. A knock on the door gave her pause. Charlotte and Rachel entered, looking exhausted but satisfied. "The board has voted," Rachel announced. "The merger is officially off. Weber Technologies remains independent." "What about you?" Madison asked, noticing how the Avery sisters were holding hands, a bond strengthened through adversity. "We're going to restructure the company," Charlotte replied. "Do things the right way this time?" She hesitated. "Actually, we've come to make a proposal." Madison raised an eyebrow. "We need someone with your unique set of skills," Rachel explained with a small smile. "Someone who understands both the corporate side and the importance of the truth. A position in the Ethics and Compliance Directorate." Madison looked down at her half-packed suitcase. For years, she had survived being other people, navigating the margins of society. Now, for the first time, someone wanted to hire her for exactly who she was. "On one condition," Madison finally said, "we use part of the profits to set up a foundation, to help people who, like me, have had to become someone else in order to survive." Charlotte smiled, a genuine smile that Madison had never been able to replicate perfectly. "Welcome to the family, Madison Porter." The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere, Alexander Avery was facing the consequences of his actions. Somewhere, Nicholas was beginning his healing process. And there, in that small apartment in Queens, 3 women, 2 sisters, and a former imposter were beginning to write a new chapter. Not a story of deceit and masks, but one of redemption, truth, and second chances. Madison looked at her reflection in the window one last time. Finally, the person she saw was herself.